And I think I should exit this. I think we're on close the YouTube. Can I close this without it being closed for everyone else? I guess so. So is it still on YouTube? Yes, it says we're recording live on YouTube. Okay. Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Shall we begin? What do we think? We want to wait another minute? One, okay. Let's begin, as I'm not sure how long people want to just stare at our faces. Huh? Hi, everyone. Pariya Gadzik. My name is Ara Araz, and on behalf of our host, St. Leon Armenian Church, I wish you all a good evening, a good afternoon, and if it's in the middle of the night where you are, thank you for stealing some time from your sleep to join us for the maiden discussion with Henry Theriault and Khachik Muradyan on Khachik's new book, The Resistance Network. If you've not yet had a chance to pick up a copy of The Resistance Network, you may visit the online bookstore of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research by going to nasr.org. That's NAASR.org. This event is a collaborative event, and we thank all of our co-sponsors. They are Stockton University's the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, and the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center. And we thank its director, Raz Siegel. Thank you, Raz, for being with us. Ejibu Ararat, the Ararat Eskidjan Museum, and its director, Maggie Mangasarian Goshen, the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party, the Armenian Network of America, the Armenian Society of Columbia University, the Daughters of Vartan, Sahaganush Otiag, the Knights of Vartan, Bakraduni Lodge, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the Research Institute of Turkey, or on Turkey, St. Leon Armenian Church, and our friends at the Zoravik Armenian Activist Collective. Please keep an eye out for upcoming collaborative events. One is being planned for Umit Kurt and his upcoming book, The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. He will be joined by Dirk Moses from the University of North Carolina. Today is a fitting day to discuss resistance to man's inhumanity to man, as it is Holocaust Remembrance Day. As such, this evening, we are particularly mindful of the victims of the Holocaust, including the surviving victims and their families. God bless all of their souls, console the living, heal, repair, and prevent. We are fortunate that tonight's discussion will be moderated by Mark Mamigonyan. Mark has served as Nasser's Director of Academic Affairs since 2009. He is the editor of the book, The Armenians of New England, has served as editor of the Journal of Armenian Studies, is the co-author of the annotated editions of James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Ulysses, and has authored several articles on the aspects of denial of the Armenian Genocide. Thank you, Mark, for graciously accepting our invitation. I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ara, and thank you as well to all the collaborating organizations. It is a great group effort to come together for this evening for this event, focusing on an important new publication. So I'm going to just offer some introductory remarks and information about our two featured speakers and the new book that this event is centering on before we get started. So let me tell you about the two speakers. First of all, Khachig Muradyan. Khachig is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University in the city of New York, and he was very recently appointed as the Armenian and Georgian Area Specialist in the Near East section of the Library of Congress, and really just began this new exciting phase in his career at the beginning of January. So it's a twofold celebration, really, for Khachig. Khachig holds a PhD in history from Clark University, the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He holds a graduate certificate in conflict resolution from UMass Boston and a Bachelor of Science in biology from Haigazian University in Beirut. He has previously served as the Henry S. Khanzadian Khazan Visiting Professor at California State University, Fresno. He has taught at Rutgers University, Worcester State University, Clark University, and Stockton University. He is the former editor of Aztag newspaper in Beirut, the Armenian weekly newspaper in Watertown, and is currently the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, The Armenian Review. His first book, The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918, has just been published by Michigan State University Press as part of the series Texts and Studies in Armenian History, Society, and Culture, created by the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. This important new book, of course, is the focus of tonight's program. Khachig will be conversing with Professor Henry Theriault, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University, current President of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and an authority on genocide and human rights, reparations, victim-perpetrator relations, genocide denial, genocide prevention, and mass violence against women and girls. All in all, an entirely appropriate interlocutor for tonight. And I would like to read you a brief description of the book to give you a sense of what it covers. The Resistance Network is the history of an underground network of humanitarians, missionaries, and diplomats in Ottoman Syria who helped save lives of thousands during the Armenian Genocide. In this book, Khachig challenges depictions of Armenians as passive victims of violence and subjects of humanitarianism, demonstrating the key role they played in organizing a humanitarian resistance against the destruction of their people. Piecing together hundreds of accounts, official documents, and missionary records, Muradian presents a social history of genocide and resistance in wartime Aleppo and a network of transit and concentration camps stretching from Bab to Ras Al Ain and Deir Zor. He ultimately argues that despite the violent and systematic mechanisms of control and destruction in the cities, concentration camps, and massacre sites in the region, the genocide of the Armenians did not progress unhindered. Unarmed resistance proved an important factor in saving countless lives. There are a great many things to be said about this book and its contents. Of course, I will leave this to the author and to Professor Theriault, but I would like to zero in on one important phrase in the book's acknowledgments, where the author thanks several entities for their financial support, including Nasser and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies. Why is this so important to me? I can say it's because there's hardly anything more gratifying to me personally or for Nasser, and I think I can speak for the Knights of Vartan as an organization, than seeing work that has been supported through grants coming to full fruition and entering into the world as a work of fully developed scholarship. In Khachig's case, where we have known and worked with him in multiple capacities over the course of now some 15 years, witnessing his advancement as a journalist, activist, graduate student, researcher, lecturer, newly minted PhD, academic, collaborator, and friend, it is truly gratifying to provide this introduction and to congratulate him on the twin major accomplishments of his new position at the Library of Congress, where we know Armenian interests will be well represented into the future, and with the publication of the Resistance Network, which shines much needed light on previously unknown or little known aspects of the Armenian Genocide. So with that, let's hear from our speakers now, Khachig Muradian and Henry Theriault. And please, if you have questions, you must submit them via the Zoom Q&A function. We will get to as many as we can following the speakers, and please make them on topic. Thank you. Please unmute yourselves, gentlemen.
We actually didn't decide who would go first. So Khachig, why don't you start and then I will come in if that would be okay.
Sure. I just want to thank Ara and Mark, Nasser, all the organizers and co-sponsors. In fact, some of the co-sponsors and organizers, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to reference them in our discussion, have direct connections to the some of the central arguments that I present in the book, some of the central figures in the book. One example is Eskijian, Reverend Eskijian, who is, a prominent figure in the book. In fact, the book opens with him, and we have as one of the co-sponsors, the Arad Eskijian Museum. So thank you again. Thank you to Nasser as well. Thank you for your generous introduction, Mark, and for your support over the years. And I will, stop here. And Hank, please take the lead.
Yeah, just to say, of course, to thank everyone who had a hand in organizing this, and a particular, I guess we'll have to say, shout out to Ara Aras, who has become a powerful force in recent years in developing innovative programs, formerly based at St. Leon's Church in New Jersey, but because of COVID and the increased capacity that we've developed with Zoom and other online platforms, has become quite globalized. I'd like to thank him especially for putting this together, but everyone else also was involved in co-sponsoring. It's great. I also have to thank Khachig for writing a book and letting me do basically nothing and get to be on a panel with him. He's done all the hard work and I just get to talk with him about it, which is wonderful. It really is truly an honor to be here with him. I've known Hachig now for almost 20 years, hard as that is to seem. He was quite young back when I first met him in Beirut. And I have seen him have multiple careers that any of us would be more than proud to have had, as a really significant journalist and editor, media presence for through the Armenian Weekly and other venues, and as someone who's been very present in policy circles and in other ways, and now as what we'll say as a pure scholar, who now is going to be at the at one of the most significant library institutions in the world, overseeing Armenian activities and so forth, is just tremendous. Any one of those is a great accomplishment. The fact that he's been able to do those and teach my children how to play chess and other things is just a testament to his just incredible intelligence and wide-ranging engagement with the world, which I think has enriched all of us in different ways. So I really want to appreciate him in that way, and really talk to how important this book is in opening up some new paths for Armenian genocide studies. I think we're seeing this work as part of a crucial new movement in Armenian genocide studies, where, and Hachig talks about this, where we've moved beyond denial, we've moved beyond some of the more reactive approaches to scholarship to open up on our own terms some crucial questions and issues that are allowing us to understand the Armenian genocide and translate that understanding into important consequences for today, for genocide prevention, for other kinds of issues, in directions that, quite honestly, even a decade ago, I wouldn't have really understood, and it's just very impressive and very important. So I think that's great. I think this book makes a number of really key contributions. One of them, although if you read the title, you think, okay, Armenian resistance movements, that's a particular issue within the broader area of Armenian studies, Armenian genocide studies. But actually the book, the way that he engages this, really touches all aspects of motivation for perpetration, the overall structures and means of executing the genocide as a whole, and much more. And so what you actually get with this book are not just engagements of a wide range of Armenian genocide issues, but really the filling of a number of gaps in our understanding of the Armenian genocide in ways that I think that make it at once an important complement to some of the key works that we've seen over the past maybe 3 or 4 decades, but also establish a new sort of standard for how to engage the Armenian genocide in once a very nuanced, on the ground way, but also with a very complex theoretical apparatus. I really am, give my praise for the way in which Hachig has, I won't say appropriated, that's not the right word, but has adopted or taken on some really key theoretical frameworks from Holocaust studies, from genocide studies, from urban studies, and even from postmodern philosophy and other places, looking at sort of agency of victims and so on. That he's been able to take that on is impressive enough, but he's actually remolded these into a new framework that has enabled him to expose, in the case of the Armenian genocide, from the primary data that's still, wealth of data that are available to us, new aspects of the genocide that have really been hidden, ignored, or just completely not understood for now decades of otherwise excellent scholarship. I think this is really exciting. I see it as a kind of archaeology of Armenian agency. He's really uncovered this important stuff from documents 100 years ago and some survivor work later, to uncover what's been hidden to us in a way that is giving us tremendous insight into the genocide as a whole. And I see this as really occasioning something akin to what maybe a decade ago happened with the memory studies movement. It's a sort of material parallel or an organizational on the ground activity parallel to what memory studies has done for our understanding of the Armenian genocide, but also other cases as well. I also want to put in a pitch. It sounds like, wow, my gosh, in a couple hundred pages, this must be incredibly theoretically dense to do what I just said it does. But in fact, Hachig and his training as a journalist, his incredible ability as a journalist, I think probably had some impact here, has also written a highly accessible and comprehensible book, which for those who have read some things in the scholarly field will know that's no simple accomplishment. Yes, there are a wealth of details, but they're presented in narrative structures that are very accessible, very engaging, as hard as the subject matter is, and that also continually throughout the book are clearly linked to the overall explanations and arguments he's giving for how we need to rethink some of the aspects of the Armenian genocide. I think it's an amazing book in that sense, and I think you come away with really enriched theoretical understandings of the genocide, but also a lot of concrete, I won't say information, it's more than that, a lot of new concrete insights into what happened, what it was like on the ground, how Armenians died, how they survived, what was happening around it. So anyway, I can't say enough in praise about those kinds of aspects of the book. And I just want to move here and then really invite Hachig in to talk about some key issues. There are a lot of particular things that I found, and I use the word exciting, really exciting about the book, even though of course the content, the topic is a hard one to engage. I found myself just reading some of the passages, even as someone who has read endless amounts of survivor testimony, eyewitness accounts, and so forth, very moved by some of the accounts that Hachig has incorporated as particularly good illustrations of things he was trying to address. But I just wanted to mention, some themes, and then we'll come back and discuss these more, and some real points that I think single this book out. One is a much more complicated understanding of humanitarianism and Armenian agency, and this is something that we've been lacking. I think a lot of scholarship that has uncovered the sort of U.S. involvement, humanitarian involvement, and so forth, has been wonderful in showing things that were being done. But what Hachig has done is actually talked about what that was on the ground. It's one thing that people raised money, they took money, they got money into the hands of the American consulate and so forth. It's quite another to try to understand exactly how that was used and in an incredibly complex dynamic situation on the ground, and how crucial Armenians, both as sort of parts of that network of humanitarianism, but also as people sort of at a more basic level as victims and so forth, had to operate and interact to make that humanitarianism actually work in a successful way. I think one of the things that we see as a model for understanding successful, or at least partially, or as much as it could be successful, humanitarian relief efforts. And we see them in a much more complicated way than I think is very typical in a lot of the literature, not just on the Armenian genocide, but on other genocides. So I think that's great. I think just on a sort of particular intellectual note, I think his integration of urban studies and a focus on the urban environment, which is something he actually taught on at Worcester State for a course a few years ago, is really exciting and new, and is going to make this book, I think, very relevant to the field of urban studies, which is a very new but really growing field. Former student of mine, Tiara Yanian, who's in the audience today, was in that field. That's part of her training in genocide studies. I think this is going to be a new and exciting area. And I think Hachig's book is going to be read very widely in that field by people who have really very little connection to the Armenian genocide and Armenian genocide studies. I think that's going to be exciting. I think it's going to raise the profile of this historical event in ways that has not been previously. I think the understanding of the physical space of the desert and the relationship and sort of complicated physical connection to the urban environment, I think is also really important. I will just add briefly, adding to that the function of rivers and also what was happening on the rivers, which often is just portrayed as a kind of a scene of horror, but not really interrogated the way I think that Hachig has done, I think is really important. Another feature of the book that I think maybe many of us, anybody who's read it so far, probably couldn't help but see, is the role of disease and the analysis of disease, which I think also is really important in that Hachig does not simplify the role of disease either as sort of outcome of genocide that was inevitable but not intentional, or simple biological warfare tool. He's doing much more subtle work on the way that disease at once was the result of genocide that overwhelmed the boundaries of the Armenian population to affect other, including members of the perpetrator population, but at the same time was quickly recognized as an important tool of genocide by the perpetrators. And the way that he sort of tells that complicated process or explains it, I think is really important. And I think, you know, the concrete, and I hate to use that word again, but the concrete analysis of the camps as individual camps, but also as of the camp system and of their role within the Armenian genocide has brought to the center what, at least for me, has never been clearly understood in the history of the Armenian genocide. And while there has been some really important work, maybe in the last decade or so, I think this foregrounding of the camps as a system is incredibly important. And I think, again, it's going to take this book not just as an incredibly important intervention in Armenian genocide studies, but as a similarly important contribution to the very small but growing literature on the history of the concentration camp that we're seeing, that's sort of grown out of Holocaust literature as scholars of the Holocaust have recognized these precedents in other areas. The last thing I will add is on the circling back before I close off my mic and turn this over to Hachig. On the issue of Armenian resistance, one of the big contributions of this work is to take it from very important earlier contributions. I'm thinking of the Miller Survivors book, the oral history book, published, I believe, in 1993, and other works that did recognize Armenian resistance to the genocide, but saw it as discrete acts by individuals in particular situations. So mass suicides by girls and women in order to avoid rape, for instance, were examples of this resistance. What Hachig has shown us is an organized, multi-year, complicated organizational process and structure and engagement that has given us tremendous new insight in what the very concept of Armenian resistance to the Armenian genocide can even mean. We are in entirely new territory with this, and it is really important territory. With that, I'm going to turn over the mic to Hachig, maybe to respond to and elaborate on some of those issues, if he might.
Thank you, Hank, for your very generous and kind introduction. I will try to address a few of these, and perhaps we can also, feel free to interject with questions, comments. Let me start with the last bit. One of the things that, and I do say this in the book, this work really stands on the shoulders of survivors, and it stands on the shoulders of survivors. Not just because of this is a way in which I'm trying to tell their stories, but at the same time because of the large volume of testimonies, accounts, memoirs, diaries, minutes of meetings that have been that they have left behind and that have been preserved in individual, in private family collections, in archives around the globe, or in libraries and museums. And it's important to really emphasize this element. One of the things that this book does is it really tries to bring this volume of Armenian language primarily documents and accounts into conversation with the missionary archives, with the Ottoman archives, with consular correspondence and reports. And in that sense, in many ways, it tries to address what you mentioned earlier in terms of thinking about humanitarianism in a different way. Because in many ways, oftentimes, the Armenian genocide, the history of the Armenian genocide is sort of presented as caught between perpetrators and saviors. On the one hand, the Armenians, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, the young Turks are massacring Armenians. On the other, the Western humanitarians and diplomats are saving Armenians, and the Armenians are caught in the middle, either being massacred or being saved, right? This passive aspect is oftentimes very glaringly present in many accounts in scholarship. And the way in which we think about genocide in general, by the way, this is not a shortcoming that is limited to the study of the Armenian genocide. And so this is a way in which this book tries to really demonstrate how the role that Armenians themselves played. And not just the Armenians who were in Aleppo, who engage in this very elaborate effort to save Armenians as they are arriving in the region in Syria, but also the very deportees and the targets and the victims who are transformed as they arrive into their destination, which is supposed to be their death sentence, right? Into agents of unarmed resistance, saving many others like them from death. So let me first quickly give a brief 1-minute summary of the Armenian genocide and where the book really picks up and the region and the time period that the book looks at. So the Armenian genocide, the destruction, the deportation, destruction of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire starts with the deportation of Armenians from their ancestral homes and towns in the general direction of what is today Syria. And in what is referred to as the first phase of the genocide, we have hundreds of thousands of Armenians who were killed in outright massacres, as well as a consequence of exposure, disease, and other forms of violence. Now, what happens is that as these deportations and massacres begin in April 1915, sometimes a little earlier, there is, by May 1915, the trickle of surviving Armenians who have survived these marches or the different forms in which they were being transported start arriving in what is today Syria. Primarily, they arrive in Aleppo or Ras Al Ain, and so these become important locations, important hubs of both the deportation and the genocide on the one hand, and resistance to them, to it on the other. So what happens is that beginning in May 1915, as hundreds of Armenians who have survived the initial rounds of deportations and massacres are starting to trickle into Syria, there's a local Armenian community in Aleppo, around 10,000 people, who Armenian Catholic, there's an Armenian Catholic Church, Armenian Apostolic Church, and an Armenian Evangelical Church, and they organize relief efforts without realizing the enormity of what is really going on. Initially, they believe that they're going to help these refugees, these deportees for the short term, and then afterwards everybody's going to have access to their funds. They're going to be able to go back pretty soon, and the numbers, they have no idea that an entire nation is being marched to their destruction. And so this initial movement that typically starts as a humanitarian relief effort is in the margins of the genocidal process. I say that because the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, the central authorities, are focused on the ethnic cleansing and the destruction of the Armenians in the Ottoman provinces across the empire. And they pay little attention to what is happening to this trickling of survivors into Ottoman Syria. So this is the general picture. So what happens is that I focus, the entire work focuses on Ottoman Syria, particularly the triangle between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor. The first half of the book focuses on Aleppo and looks at it from an urban perspective as a city. And then the second half looks at it as the desert, and complicates the way in which we think about the desert. We look at concentration camps, other urban areas in that region, and tries to see both the action and the reaction. The attempt by the perpetrators to destroy Armenians as a group, as a culture, as an entity, and the pushback, the attempt to save Armenians. So this is the narrative. So I pick up the deportees as they start trickling into Syria, and I accompany them into survival, in their struggle, into resistance, and in many cases into what is referred to as the massacres of Deir ez-Zor in the second phase of the Armenian Genocide, where close to 200,000 Armenians are, mostly women and children, are massacred outright in the region of Deir ez-Zor. So that's the universe that I have as I try to tackle many of the questions that Henry addressed in his comments. Any thoughts, Henry, on any thing here?
I would love, I have a few questions in addition to the sort of themes I outlined, and perhaps you actually touched on one of them. It's very common to present Armenian genocide victims, certainly at the point of deportation, but also in other contexts. And I see this, in other literature as well, whether it's the Holocaust or other cases, you see this as well, as really never gaining an understanding of the nature of what is happening to them and what their fate is. And you deal with that in a complicated way. Obviously, early on, people didn't know, and it can be argued that the full genocidal process hadn't taken shape. But the fact that we see an organized resistance apparatus and that it persists over time, I'm wondering if that has implications that can maybe change our understanding of what Armenians actually understood at the time of what was going on, and how you would see that. So maybe that would be a question I'm very interested in hearing more about.
Yes. So Armenians were not newcomers to humanitarian relief efforts. In previous decades, each attack, onslaught on the Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire, each case of massacres, beginning from the 1894-96 Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacres of 1909, and other cases of outbreaks of violence over the decades, the community had developed a way, typically through the church and the institutions around it, had developed a way of mending the wounds. It was a system that they had figured out of taking care of the children, trying to educate the women, even sometimes sending them to universities and schools after they're widowed, trying to create an environment where women's organizations try to reach out to the children and many women and help. Other organizations, created institutions, orphanages. So there was this built-in system in the Ottoman Empire by Armenians to really react to humanitarian onslaught. And what does happen here is that when these deportees, beginning in May 1915, start arriving in Aleppo, there's a similar reaction that is kicking in. It is one that does not imagine what is happening to Armenians any different than what has happened in the past. It does not imagine it as anything that is anymore, although the Hamidian massacres really spanned across large swath of the empire, in any form in terms of enormity any worse than that. So there's no conception of this, largely, by and large. And so the reaction is almost to the level of paying individual attention to these deportees. You know, not just providing assistance to all of them and shelter and food, but also I give the example of a woman who had a problem with her eyesight. And what happens is that, and she's in one of the camps outside of Aleppo, and the committee that is formed by the Armenian prelacy actually has her brought to Aleppo so that a doctor can examine her. This proves almost impossible, this level of individual attention, just a few weeks later. So we really see that the community within a couple months is overwhelmed. On the one hand, with the tens of thousands arriving, now in worse condition because they're coming from farther away. Most of the men have been massacred. The women are emaciated, the children, the elderly are in horrendous form. And on the one hand, this is overwhelming the system. And on the other, the central authorities are now that they're largely done with the destruction of the Armenian people in the provinces across the empire, are now turn their attention to Syria and start managing that issue and going after the Armenian deportees there. And therefore, this network of Armenian humanitarians working together with locals, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, other Christian groups, as well as diplomats and missionaries, is now not just engaging in humanitarian relief, but because the government is now against engaging in that kind of help, towards deportees, this network goes underground largely and starts operating in a clandestine way, secretly, and continuing to do the same kind of work. And so there is this kind of other shift as well. So in the past, the way it worked was that the central authority, massacres would happen, and then Armenians would be left to pick up the pieces. So there was this effort that was not something that the government directly intervened in order to crush, the humanitarian effort. In this case, right, initially the community thinks that that's what's going to happen. They're going to receive the support of the government. And that doesn't materialize. Local authorities sometimes do support because, again, there were, for example, in the case of Aleppo, the governor of Aleppo was friendly to Armenians initially. He's replaced. So what happens is that it's a different dynamic now because the government does not, it's not only the massacre that's being coordinated by the authorities, but also there's every effort to actually ameliorate the situation of those who survive it. And that is a critical change from before.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very, very enlightening and really appreciate it. Sort of a related, I will say, semi-conceptual question. And this is another place where I think the book is really nuanced and really opened my eyes to things I hadn't understood sort of on the ground before. At one point early on, you define what you mean by resistance. And it's essentially, if I can say it in simplified terms, it's going against the intentions of those in authority. But you couch that in legal terms quite a bit by talking about the fact that it is true that the Ottoman Empire really used laws, as other genocidal states have done, to sort of quote unquote, legalize or give legal form to the human rights violations they were engaging in. At the same time, especially, and that makes sense when we talk about going underground, at the same time, maybe earlier in the process, maybe at different points, there seems to be a lot of, gray area and room for negotiation that may be particularly specific to the Ottoman form of bureaucracy and leadership, where individual people's attitudes at different levels, all the way down, obviously, to guard, gendarme and very local people, could greatly impact, at least at a very localized level, the survival of individual Armenians and even groups of Armenians. And I'm wondering, how does law play into this, and what is the tension between sort of what is being conceived centrally, which you talk about, with what's happening on the ground, and is resistance also the willingness to try to negotiate, and I say negotiate in a broad sense, exactly how things are implemented? I was wondering if maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Thank you. So here, the situation on the ground, as you highlighted, is very different than the crystallized orders that are coming from above, because typically, right, both in terms of there's a lag, on the one hand. So when there's an order, it's not like it is happening; it is being executed simultaneously across the Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, it's not being executed in the same way in every province. There are individual differences among the leadership. And there are additional factors that are influencing this. The Ottoman Empire is at war. That's an important factor. And in different locations, the priorities shift and change. And I demonstrate that particular in the region under study in the book. That plays a role, and Armenians at certain junctures take advantage of that. And so that the war is another important factor. Another factor is that on the ground, many people in positions of power, be they in the military, be they civilian authorities, be they leaders of local groups, bandits, everyone is trying to maximize the benefits and the profits they can get out of this. And this complicates things because that effort is not always going in sync with what the perpetrators, with Talat Pasha as the mastermind and leading this process, actually have in mind all the time. Sometimes it leads to some lags. Sometimes some local leaders actually take it further than Talat wants them to take it because it becomes too overt. And he intervenes and tries to say, all right, be careful here. And the other important element here is that everybody, as I said, is trying to take advantage of this situation. And then there are internal rivalries and dynamics that are at play. And in all of this, Armenians are on the ground, are trying to glean this. Now, it's easy for us 100 years later to look back and think of this as this order that is coming down. Every single Armenian is targeted, and everybody is being killed, massacred, in that kind of way. But on the ground, Armenians are making choices every single day. And these are choices about who can I bribe in order to stay a few more days in my hiding place in Aleppo so that I'm not deported. Or when they are in a concentration camp, right? Which guard is going to be able to help me? What are some of the ways in which, so there's this space that is created where many Armenians are going to interact with locals, are going to interact with local authorities, and in order to save their lives and the lives of people they know. On the other hand, what is happening is that the central authorities, Talat Pasha and others, are trying to regulate this process. The government wants a monopoly over violence, right? They don't want essentially tribes, groups to go around and engage in violence without any kind of structure. And they don't want that to be just rampant because it disrupts the way in which they're operating. And on the other hand, they are very unhappy about the pace of the deportations and massacres that are influenced by people in the middle trying to maximize benefits. Quick example, in concentration camps, you will see certain times that because of bribes that camp officials are taking, thousands of Armenians who are supposed to be redeported, their redeportation is delayed for months. And this really frustrates the central authorities who want this process to go very quickly. But on the ground, the local authorities are getting money, and whoever is paying, they're keeping them in these camps much longer than these people are supposed to be there in terms of the orders. So there is this. And on the other hand, the Armenian reaction is just a couple words about that. It's important to think about the fact that Armenians are human beings, and in that sense, in many ways, their reaction is a range as well. So there are many Armenians who are going to be resisting as individuals. They're making, as I said, choices every moment, every day. This is not a process where they're thinking, this is a genocide, we're all going to die. Everyone is trying to live another day. Everyone is trying to survive. And in that process, many people are engaged in resistance. Other people are engaged in other ways of saving their lives, including collaboration. So in the book, I also show how resistance is an important part, organized resistance, of a broader resistance that occurs, and also an even broader range of reactions by Armenians, deportees, some of whom will try to take advantage of fellow Armenians to survive. Others will try to be part of the machinery of destruction in order to save their lives just for a few more months. And I do get into some detail. I do provide detail into that process as well. So that is also something that I wanted to emphasize in that regard.
Thanks, and I've got the signal from Mark that I get to ask you one more question, so I'm having to choose from many. And it is this one as we think about the situation of Armenians today. One of the fascinating sort of implications of the book, and you talk about this in the last part, is the way in which this resistance work, the organizational, attitudinal, and other aspects of it, actually laid the groundwork for post-genocidal rebuilding of Armenian, not just Armenian communities, but Armenian identity, sense of self. And it really got me thinking about how important it is that you highlight Armenian agency in all of this. Even in the worst of circumstances, Armenians were trying to organize, they were trying to resist, they were trying to do something. And that attitude carries over, even though oftentimes it was futile, as you know, unfortunately we learn, it was futile over the long run for many, many people who died or were enslaved and so forth. Ultimately, once the genocide is in the past, once Syria is separate from the Turkish Empire, if I can say it that way, from Turkey, that effort starts to bear some fruit. I was wondering if you can comment on that, just in general in terms of the genocide era, but also, are there lessons we need to be paying attention to as we look at the contemporary refugee crisis and land loss and so forth that Armenians are facing today because of what's happened in Artsakh?
Again, thank you. Great question. And I'm trying to formulate my thoughts so that I just emphasize a few elements here.
I'm asking you to lay out Armenian policy for the next 10 years, basically. So I realize that's a challenge.
One interesting element is that in this process, what is going on the ground is, again, I show this in the book, in the second half of the book, that it's not the separation between, okay, the genocide is over, and and then let's start rebuilding is not clear cut, of course. The Ottoman defeat, we know when it happens. We know when the Ottoman withdrawal from Damascus, Aleppo occurs. So in that sense, there is a clear demarcation between the period during which the Ottoman Turks controlled the region and the period when they withdrew. However, on the ground, this process of survival, resistance, and then attempts to create some kind of livelihood and rebuild starts occurring beginning in 1917, a full year before the war is over. This is a period when by 1916, in the summer of 1916 and fall of 1916, it stretches into the fall, after the massacres of Deir Zor, where again, an overwhelming number of survivors are massacred outright, the dynamics change in the region. And in certain areas, Armenians start to really are able to navigate in particular localities life in a way that's a little more relaxed. And of course, 1918 becomes the Ottoman defeat is an important turning point. But even after the withdrawal of the Ottomans, Armenians are rebuilding, but the danger has not disappeared. So I talk briefly about a pogrom that happens in Aleppo where dozens of Armenians are killed by a mob, most likely incited by local leaders, quite possibly connected with with Ottoman connection, with the Ottoman authorities on the other side of the new border at this point. So this is a very challenging period, and this is a period where people have high hopes of returning. This is a period where from all over Syria, survivors are moving into Aleppo, because from there, their hope is to move to their ancestral homes and villages. And this creates a set of challenges that I don't want to get into right now in order to say a couple more things about your question. What are some of the lessons from this? There are many. One of them is that it seems that in many cases, whenever in the book, in the first half, the process of resistance is very organized by institutions, primarily churches. So the leadership is largely male. In the second half of the book, where as Armenians are placed in concentration camps and they're pushed towards the desert, right? Because it is outside the immediate network and the structures, it's not just the people on the ground. Women are not just people who are on the ground who are doing the work, but also there you see more women taking initiative, taking leadership roles, because this is a place where the traditional structures of the community are not operating. So it's really interesting to think about gender in that regard as well. In Aleppo too, whenever you see Armenian women playing very critical role, it is often happening outside of the network by women who are somewhat loosely connected to the network. And I talk about that. I give a number of names. Elmas Santurian is one. Jebejian is another. She is one of the key figures in Deir Zor trying to save deportees, and she dies. She's killed right before the Deir Zor massacres. So there are many women who emerge in this, and it's important to think about this as a community, right? About how it works when usual community structures are operating, and the moment you transform that, you have these women coming forth. A few other elements have to do with the way in which rebuilding happens, the way in which, again, it's difficult for people experiencing today the horrors of what happened in Artsakh and the crimes committed there and dispossession and dislocation. It's in many ways, when we look back at that period, right, the kind of uncertainty that we feel, many of us feel here, and of course, in a much more emphasized manner, people feel in Armenia and Artsakh, this sense of lack of clarity. What is going to happen, and in trying to rebuild in that environment, I feel like there's a much that we can glean and learn from 100 years ago, including the fact that there will always be imperfections, and there will always be challenges, and there will always be issues related to corruption and other challenges. But ultimately, the community finds a way of working around and sometimes beyond it to really find itself. And if that was possible in the time of genocide, I believe it is also possible today.
If I can jump in now, gentlemen. Actually, the first question I wanted to ask Khachig comes out of comments you just made in your last response to Henry's difficult and complicated question. And that is that to the extent that there had been literature and focus on resistance, by and large, up until recently, it had focused on armed resistance, the famous episodes of armed resistance, for example, in Van and other locations. And those tended to be focused on males who were doing most of the fighting. Your book changes the focus and places quite a bit of emphasis on the role of women and even of children in the humanitarian resistance that you write about. So I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about that beyond what you just said in your previous remarks.
Thank you, Mark. In many ways, one of the things that emerged, when I started working on this was my dissertation. I had 3 advisors I mentioned earlier that I stand on the shoulders of survivors and their accounts, but I also stand on the shoulders of my advisors, Taner Aksham, Raymond Kevorkian, and Deborah Dwork. And in many ways, you can, and I do say more about this in the book, you can see how that their work and also the way they think about many of these issues have influenced this. Now, specifically, as I was working on my dissertation, one of the things that I realized was that how the idea of an archive complicates the discussion. On the one hand, I am using Armenian sources in order to triangulate between Armenian, Ottoman, German, other sources, and try to have a better understanding of the situation. On the other hand, so I'm saying that let us not just emphasize, Western sources or Ottoman sources. At the same time, I'm realizing that within the Armenian sources, there is a hierarchy that has to do with certain archives, certain voices being heard, certain voices never being able to tell their stories. Many of the people in the resistance network who die or are killed, we know significantly less about them than those who continue serving the Aleppo Armenian community or the Armenian communities around the world in the aftermath of the genocide. So I find myself in a situation where I have to do that as well, to engage with that. And as I'm doing this, one of the tremendous rewards of this research project was getting to know families of people who opened their family archives, their family records. And this is where the role of women became even more palpable. Why? Because, for example, when I used the minutes of the Armenian prelacy in Aleppo, of the committee that is formed there, they are meeting every single day. And it's rich in detail about what is going on. They are preparing lists of deportees. There's tremendous work. But every single member of this committee overwhelmingly are men. And therefore, again, the narrative is different. The role of women who are operating outside is not there. While when you look at it from other places, in the orphanages in Aleppo, in the efforts in hospitals, in the efforts of individual members, women who are leading, people I talk a lot about include Nora Altunyan, Elmas Santurian. These are saving hundreds of men, women, children. Jebejian, or actually Jebejian, both in terms of providing information from their Zor to missionaries and teachers, Beatrice Roner, for example, in Aleppo, who in turn is sending these reports to diplomats, who are in turn sending them overseas, and in the newspapers around the world, people are reading what's happening to Armenians. So in many ways, you have these women who are playing a critical role. And I try to, as much as possible, with the very little that can be pieced together, to tell their story. And finally, very briefly, I do talk about children as well as agents, as actors, because children are not just people who are we're supposed to take care of in orphanages. I demonstrate that during the Armenian Genocide, there were many children who were forced to take matters into their own hands. But not only that, they also participated in the resistance network by communicating messages from one concentration camp to the other and in other ways.
Thank you. I've got a question here from your colleague and fellow Clark PhD, Raz Siegel. Thank you, Raz, for the question. Could you please, Khachig, talk a bit about your work in relation to debates within Holocaust studies, where some work has focused more on resistance and agency of the victims, claiming that it was central, whereas others have argued that the framework of resistance has blinded us to the realities of victims of genocide who primarily experienced disintegration on individual, family, and communal levels with very little agency in the midst of war and violence. If you could comment on that.
Thank you so much for that question, Raz. Let me first start by saying that in the case of Armenian Genocide scholarship, it was largely modeled after the intentionalist model of Holocaust scholarship. And as such, and also a number of other factors complicated the early decades of Armenian Genocide studies, including the denial by the Turkish state. right? This is a situation where many Armenian genocide scholars were operating in a world where there's a state-sponsored denial. And in that kind of situation, what happened is that the framework and the narrative that was created was largely modeled after the Holocaust, right? And that is important. That's an important point to make. In that model, it was in a way that the Armenian genocide was progressing in an unrelenting manner. Everybody was targeted. There was very little room for resistance. When these are part of the discussions that we read about in Holocaust studies a few decades earlier, right? About Armenians going into their deaths like sheep, etc. Now, on the other hand, the humanitarianism aspect is also emphasized because it is a way in which we think that the world can pay attention to a genocide that is not acknowledged. So in the United States, there is conversation about the role that Near East Relief and other organizations played, the millions of dollars that was raised here. And it's a way of saying to the American public, your ancestors did this, and now your government is not willing to acknowledge this crime, even though your ancestors were part of this process. So these are important things people are engaging in. And at the same time, this is what makes these individuals, Armenians, who are a driving force in the resistance, particularly in the unarmed resistance that I'm talking about here, to be really marginalized. So although I have no illusions about how ultimately in genocide, right, when there is this attempt by a state to annihilate an entire group, right, how difficult, challenging, even futile resistance is. At the same time, when we look at the situation on the ground in the case of the Armenian genocide, and I venture say in the case of many other cases, it is important to think about on two levels. One is that individuals and the role they're playing in pushing back, even though oftentimes the choices they're making on a daily basis, again, to borrow from Holocaust studies, are choiceless choices. And at the same time, to realize that oftentimes there was also an organized element to this. And I take Aleppo as a case, but I can emphasize that a book can be written about a similar network in Constantinople, in the heart of the Ottoman Empire. A similar book can be written about in other regions, including Kharper and elsewhere, about people engaging in organized unarmed resistance. There is one tremendous, beautiful example of this. There's a group that is formed in Istanbul of Armenian intellectuals and activists who go underground. They escape arrest, the initial rounds of arrests, April 24 and the following weeks. And they make their job collecting reports from across the Ottoman Empire about what's going on and figuring out ways of leaking them, of getting them outside the country through consuls, through other contacts, sometimes through using invisible ink on newspapers that are shipped outside. And again, this is an effort that is done against the will of the authorities. And that is how many people learn in the outside world what is going on. In many ways, such as this, I see a major role that is being played by the victims. Even though, yes, up to 1.5 million Armenians are killed. And when I see this, when I write about this, it is not about, oftentimes I think, it's not, the Armenian genocide is not as bad as you think. It is worse than what you think. Because when you look at it at that level, when you see this daily struggle of these people as are trying to organize and push back, and the onslaught that is coming, it really makes us think about the crime in a very different way than general pictures that, in the case of the Armenian genocide, we've had for a long time. And again, I owe much to, of course, many scholars who've done work before me, but also to those survivors who jotted down, those who wrote diaries, those who wrote the meeting minutes, it is through them that this story is reconstructed in this way.
I hope future scholars are listening and watching right now and taking notes for potential topics of their dissertations. And if, in case anyone is wondering what else is there that can be said about the Armenian Genocide at this point, there is no end to the amount of important work still to be done. One of the major contributions of the book is its discussion of the use of concentration camps. There are a couple of questions about concentration camps during the Armenian Genocide in general. How were they similar to or different from concentration camps used in other genocides, episodes of mass violence? How many were there? How were they organized, etc.?
Thank you. So the book does, half the book takes place in concentration camps and in transit between concentration camps, the second half. And it goes into great detail. And in many ways, one thing that I try to do at the onset, the beginning of the section on concentration camps, is place it within a global perspective. That section is very brief, but what I try to do is place it on this continuum as concentration camps are invented in the late 19th century. The Spanish will use them in Cuba as a counterinsurgency weapon with horrendous civilian population deaths. But the intention was the destruction of the opposition, the insurgents, and therefore the idea is to move the civilian population into these camps in order to engage in a scorched earth policy and destroy the insurgents. This is something that is a part of the colonial experience. The Americans will do it in the Philippines, the British in South Africa during the South African War against the Boers and the local Black population. What happens in the 20th century, early 20th century, with the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia, is that the camps are actually become a tool of genocide, right? The war is largely over between the Germans and the Herero, and the survivors are placed in these camps, are worked to death. So there is a deadly strain that is evolving from the earlier cases that were very deadly, but they were not genocidal in that sense. And this is, I do see that the Armenian experience as part of that continuum. So in many ways, these are not, when we say concentration camps, it's difficult to think. I can say a lot here about that, but again, just in 1 minute, today is the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. When we talk about concentration camps, we're not talking about Auschwitz. It is, these are camps that are largely built, across nearby to rivers. Many of them do not have walls. Many of them do not have barbed wire. Some do. And because, it's a desert and it's out there, and it's all you need to do is control the perimeter of the camp, have some locals monitor and police inside the camp, and control nearby bridges on the river, and you're good. And the way they're managed, the way they're run, in a very structured way, still it's very different from what is coming with the Nazis and the KL system. Still, I do try to demonstrate that this is an integral part of the history of concentration camps in general, an integral part of this deadly strain that stretches from German Southwest Africa to the Ottoman Empire and ultimately reaches Nazi Germany.
Achagai, there's another question from one of your Clark colleagues, Dr. Asya Darpinyan. The question is this: what was the most challenging aspect of your journey from source hunting, researching, writing, revising to eventually publishing your book, and what advice do you offer to young scholars pursuing a similar path?
Perhaps the best advice is the simplest one. At the beginning of every single one of these stages, it just felt like this is not going to end. I will not be able to get to the end point. And in many ways, that's how it felt. And, you know, it is in times when you are feeling that kind of doubt, in times when there's a lot of other things and temptations about things to do and work to do and engage in, and in times when, as I was writing this dissertation, the very places that I was writing about were once more in Syria, the location of massacres and death and destruction. Deir ez-Zor was one of the flashpoints of the civil war. Raqqa was the de facto, capital of ISIS. So many of these places that I write chapters about in this book were flaring, and it was very difficult and challenging to focus on the task at hand. But ultimately, I think that and perhaps because of those challenges, I was able to think and rethink the structure of this book and the place of this book in the general conversation in a different way. So oftentimes the very challenges, the challenges themselves were also opportunities to tackle these issues differently. And they have shaped me in ways that otherwise I don't think I would have developed. As someone who is interested in teaching and learning about these issues in a different context, in a broader context, and sees much that the study of the Armenian Genocide can offer these cases and these other cases, and the study of these cases can offer the study of the Armenian Genocide.
There's a question about Armenians who continued living in Turkey after the genocide into the 20s and 30s. Were there still informational networks or humanitarian exchanges across what became the Turkish-Syrian border in the 1920s and 1930s?
The short answer is a resounding yes. And you mentioned earlier dissertations. There's great work that can be done on just first of all, the shifting of the borders and the borderlands, and the way in which Armenians, Kurds, others were traversing these borders, and the way in which they were thinking about that region. It is a very compelling topic. And what I would say is the following. One of the most striking things that I encountered in my work was how it's difficult for us to disentangle the period of the genocide from the period of the end of the war, the independence of the Republic of Armenia, what is happening with the border between Syria and the Republic of Turkey from one another. To give one example, I do actually I have translated a portion of this poem, of some poems here, but one poet who is deported to Deir ez-Zor, Sahag Mesrub, writes poetry in Deir ez-Zor in 1918, as he hears that Armenia has gained independence. And he has this poem where he talks about how the bones of the victims of the Armenian Genocide are looking up and cheering the birth of the Armenian nation in the Republic of Armenia of 1918. So in many ways, as I said, one of the most moving and powerful experiences for me to see how these regions are connected, to see how many of the figures that are important in the period during the genocide become critical figures. For example, in the stage between trying to cross the border between Turkey and Syria, critical figures in the leadership of Armenian community in Syria and also beyond, in Lebanon, in France, and the United States, and following their trajectories would be again a wonderful project. Perhaps that one I can claim for myself, and picking up where I left off. But it also really demonstrates the kind of how this scattering worked. And as this scattering was happening, how people were, wherever they end up, picking up where they left off and continuing to rebuild. One quick example is John Minacian. He is someone who is picking up envelopes from the American consul in Aleppo, Consul Jackson, whose family was gracious and gave me documents in the family records that are not available in the archives. He picks up envelopes full of money and takes them to Reverend Eskijian, who in turn is distributing it to the refugees. John Minacian ends up in the United States, and his journey, and I talk a little bit about his journey, really is an example of this kind of transnational story of the Armenian Genocide and its aftermath, which is about, yes, death and destruction, but also resistance, resilience, and rebuilding.
Thank you. There are many very good and intelligent questions, and I want to thank everyone who has submitted them. And if we don't get to all of them, please, I beg your pardon and ask that you not be offended. And we're trying to choose the ones that relate most closely to the book, but they're all excellent questions here, and thank you for them. There is, sorry, now I've lost my place. Well, it's on the role of bribes, Khachik. You touched upon it some in your comments before. Can you talk more about this? How systematic, how endemic was it, and can you compare the role of bribery during the Armenian Genocide, allowing survivors to, well, perhaps to survive a little bit longer, to in other instances of genocide?
Sorry for that. Bribes were indeed played a major role, and we see this from a number of places. For example, the committee of the Armenian prelacy in Aleppo that was, essentially throughout the war, trying to provide relief to deportees, had ledgers documenting every single day how many eggs were purchased, how many pieces of wood were purchased, everything that was done for the deportees. And these ledgers are available and maintained by the Armenian prelacy of Aleppo. In these ledgers, you see how even gendarmes who are accompanying Armenians are bribed. You have multiple instances of gifts to gendarmes throughout in the early months of the deportations. So on the one hand, there was bribing that was going on in terms of the organized network, but bribes also went a long way in many regards. Another example would be in the city of Raqqa, where you have hundreds of Armenian deportees, particularly from the Erzurum region, but others, who make a deal with the local mayor, and they pay a significant amount of money in order for hundreds of them, as I said, most of them Erzurumcis, to enter the city. And you see other survivors from other regions who are not part of this deal lamenting it and talking badly about the Erzurumcis who forgot about everybody else, right? So there's these interesting dynamics come forward. But on the individual level as well, bribes go a long way. Mind you, by the way, most Armenians who entered the city of Raqqa survived the genocide because the local authorities refused to hand over the Armenians to and send them to Deir Zor when the Deir Zor massacres were taking place, despite telegrams and orders from the center and elsewhere. And this is a fascinating story that I get into in the book. So that's a critical component. But every single, most Armenians were using bribes as an important way to get by, to survive another day, And this was part of the economy of the genocide in that sense. When I was preparing the index, I was having trouble with the word bribe and bribery because there were so many of them that I had to narrow it down. I have also narrowed down much of this. Many of our ancestors, and those of us who've heard their stories will hear about bribes. How is this connected to other cases? Again, to give the example of the Holocaust, yes, sometimes having resources and the ability to bribe your way out helps many people. In other times, having access to funds and being rich could get people killed faster than everybody else. So there are many factors that are playing a role here. Just if you think about Erzurum, other regions where, again, the wealthy people were the first to be arrested, rounded up, taken away, their wealth. So there's that dynamic playing out as well. Connections also matter. And connections both as a combination of bribes in terms of giving people money, but also in terms of favors that have been, in terms of, if an Armenian merchant has done a favor to a local official, that official may be inclined to actually try to save him or her. So there are all these things that are also playing out. Again, from a larger perspective, much of this is not really visible, but you zoom in and you see this playing out on the ground. And even some Armenians try to become intermediaries between deportees and the gendarmes and try to benefit from that. And I talk about that in the book as well, including the notorious case of a pharmacist who becomes extremely wealthy just by doing that, taking advantage of Armenian deportees, telling them that he's taking their bribes in order to get certain things done, and eventually pocketing the money. Spoiler alert, he gets killed in Derzor, and he doesn't get to enjoy the money he collects from the deportees.
I want to mention before we ask the next question, because this is asked in the questions as well, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the St. Leon Armenian Church event YouTube channel after the fact, and it will be available there. We will link to it on the Nasser website as well, so you should have no difficulty in finding it afterwards or recommending it to others. There are a couple of related questions about violent, not nonviolent, but rather violent resistance. What are your thoughts on the role of war and armed resistance? And there was a question by one audience member who interviewed a genocide survivor who told her that when two Turkish boys were attacking her, she pushed them down a well. Is there data on these sort of individual acts of violent resistance? And I would add, did the violent resistance help or complicate in negative ways the efforts of those organizing the nonviolent resistance that you chronicle?
In the region that I cover, there were indeed cases of violent resistance, but they were much smaller in scale and very, very localized, unlike some of the better known cases that we often discuss. Musadagh, Van, Shabin Karahisar, you name it. There's a number of them there. Now, what is happening here is that the one thing that I would like to emphasize is that even in the farthest points of the desert, at a time when during the massacres of Derzor, small groups of a few thousand, mostly women and children, are being taken out of the larger groups out to be massacred. I encountered a couple instances of resistance where a few of the groups, one in particular, they find out that what is happening with the other groups, because people are being told that we're going to move you to this place or that place, or they're being told all kinds of lies, right? Genocide is never, people are not told we're going to kill you all. It just makes things very messy for the perpetrator, right? So they're doing everything, even at that stage, to give some semblance, some feeling that we might survive. We're better off not doing anything. And at some point, a few people from an earlier group that is massacred escape and come and tell people what's happening. And most people don't believe them. They do not want to believe that is even possible, that they're killing every single person. But a group of actually young men decide that they're going to attack the guards and wrestle their weapons and not go with, as a convoy. And they do that. And they engage in fighting for a brief period of time. And afterwards, they are massacred on site right there, every single person. And the reason we have accounts from this is that, when you have these kinds of massacres with thousands of people, there's always going to be a few people who escape. And we know their names. Some of them end up in Aleppo, and we'll be talking to people like Beatrice Rohner, who's going to be writing reports which are available in the German archives with their names and their accounts. We know some of these people who will eventually write their own accounts and memoirs. But it is one example of this kind of, even in the most difficult circumstances, where it is unfathomable to engage in any kind of violent resistance, there is in fact an instance, the example I gave you of that.
Thank you. The next question, and possibly the last question, which I want to invite Henry to respond to this one as well. Since denial is one of the phases of genocide and one phase that is ongoing to this day, what's your perspective on resistance to this phase of genocide, of denial? And if I may editorialize and say that the work of scholarship that is in fact a form of resistance to genocide, and I want to thank you both for your efforts in that regard, and would invite you to respond to this.
I will leave this to Hank, to Henry, but I will say a couple words. It is indeed a form of resistance, particularly what is being, and it is a form of resistance everywhere, right? Because in this, when it's state-sponsored denial, which is transnational, where you have embassies engaging in it, when you have consulates engaging in it, it's like this kind of network. Everybody engaging in that struggle for acknowledgement, in that struggle for the historical record, is engaging in resistance. But in particular, it is important in the very place where these policies are being shaped, within the very boundaries where, within Turkey itself, where this has been an oppressive presence and reality for decades. And even there, Armenians and others have really resisted this, particularly in recent years, in terms of, whether it's translating works on the Armenian Genocide, diaries, memoirs, accounts, scholarship on the Armenian Genocide, whether by organizing memorial events, whether by speaking, writing articles, etc. And again, here, I want to emphasize the fact that whenever we're talking about these struggles, it's important to look for those, not who have the, let me word this as well as I can at this point, an hour and a half into this. It's important to be mindful of the fact that, just like in the case of the Resistance Network, this is not just a story of consuls and people with great influence and power really transforming the reality on the ground and saving people, but it's also some people who are lost to history. We don't know anything about their loves and dreams and desires. All we know is in one case, I only know the first name of the person. And I know that he went to Deir Zor and back over and over again until bringing money and assistance to deportees until he was found and killed. That's all I know about it. And I made sure that I include that in the book. And in many ways, the struggle in Turkey has had a similar aspect as well. Oftentimes, many people might be in the limelight, but it's also important to realize all the others who are not and who are part of this struggle, this resistance, and this fight for acknowledgement and justice.
I would only add, really just to emphasize, it's kind to even connect the issue of fighting against denial, which, certainly Hachig, Mark, myself, and many other people have spent decades doing with what Hachig presents in his book as in many cases truly heroic, and then in some cases complicated agency. But yes, I think those of us may have come under some threat at different points, especially when we've been in Turkey and so forth. But it's really not the same thing. It's resistance, but it's not resistance in the same context at all. And I, the little bit that I've contributed is really nothing compared to what I feel like I owe to the Armenian people for being part of it. And I'm sure my colleagues feel the same way. We do little what we can, but not in the same context at all. And I think, just as Hachig was saying, I think one of the values of a book like this to be a bit more, spiritual or emotional, is it really does bear witness to the lives of those whose bones are ended up in a desert somewhere without a gravestone, without any kind of marker. If it weren't for Hachig and others like him, they would truly be gone. There would be no marker. This book is in a way a grave marker and a eulogy for so many amazing people who lived and died in the most horrific of consequences and never stopped trying to help other people. And so I think in that sense, I want to be very clear that we're distinguishing anything, any of us might do from that.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. That's maybe as good a place as any to stop. The book is available. Would encourage you to purchase it now or later at your convenience, and to read it. It really you will learn much from reading the book. And I want to thank Henry, and I want to thank Hachig for your remarks and for your insights and sharing them with us tonight. I want to thank the audience and those who submitted questions. Whether we got to them or not, they're much appreciated, and we appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights with us as well. So, Araras, would you like to bring things to a conclusion?
I would by thanking you, Mark. Thank you for moderating, for screening the wonderful questions. And I know that was a difficult task to do because I could see the questions and the thought be put behind them. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Hachig. Thank you, Henry. Take care, and we look forward to seeing everyone again sooner than later.
Thank
Be
you.
well. Have a good
Bye,
week.
everyone.
Oh, actually, we could make an announcement. Hachig, you do have an upcoming talk, do you not? That will be a little bit different than this one.
Yes, we have an event organized by Columbia University that is happening in 2 weeks. And that is going to be on, let me quickly, February 9, which is a Tuesday at 6 p.m. We have 3 scholars who are going to be speaking about the book, 4 scholars, and I will be making brief remarks as well. And it will be advertised, I guess.
For sure. All the registrants will receive an email.
Yes, yes. So registrants, we will send those of you who are interested the link as well. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Henry, for your wonderful remarks. I'm really humbled by them. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Hachig, for your years of dedication in producing this incredibly important book.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to our sponsors. Good night, everyone. Be well.